so the ecosystems in terms of seeds and the variants we see. But I want to bring Oliver Morton in here and talk about the much grander schemes that we are beginning to consider. And like with biodiversity, I think geoengineering is one of those terms that we sort of hear and we bandy around, but we're not really necessarily sure what it actually means. Now, in your new book, The Planet Remade, you put these geoengineering schemes into two broad categories.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that we don't all agree on geoengineering, and it might apply to biodiversity, as well, is that within the field, people have slightly different takes on it. But for me, it's a big technological global program aimed at having a specific effect on the climate. So it's not accidentally changing the climate, it's aiming to do something deliberate to the climate. And there are, broadly speaking, at the moment, two sorts of things that people discuss. And I see them as the carbon methods and the sunshine methods. And if you think about the Earth as an engine being driven by sunlight, there are two ways to cool it down. One's to let more heat out, and those are the carbon method. That's to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and thus allow more heat to get out, thinning the greenhouse, as it were. And the other ones are the sunshine methods. That's to let a little bit less sunshine in the first place. And there are various ways that you might think about doing this. One of the ones that's most discussed, partly because we see it going on in nature anyway, is to put sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, which is something that volcanoes do, and we've got good evidence about how the climate cools after a volcano. But there are other possibilities, such as, for instance, making the clouds over the low-lying clouds over the sea reflect a bit more sunshine. And there have even been some people discussing the possibility of making crops reflect a little bit more sunshine as well.
These all seem slightly outlandish.
I think they're very outlandish.
Okay. That's what I meant, really. I was being subtle. But what was the sort of reputation of these types of ideas?
Since the early 1990s, since we started getting really serious about climate action, there's been a tendency to neglect these sort of approaches when people talk about climate, because it's hard enough to get people to focus on the overriding need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, which is still an overriding need, even if you go ahead with some of these geoengineering ideas. It's hard to get people to focus on that if you think, oh, there are other possibilities as well. And so I think there's a probably largely well-meaning tendency to think that it's best to keep quiet about these things and focus on the carbon. But I think that's just not quite good enough, partly because what we're doing with the carbon is not anything like sufficient to have the effects that we might want in terms of slowing climate change, but also because climate change is this huge, big, complex problem that goes on for decades and centuries, and to think that you can sort out its politics simply by reducing all fossil fuel use and there's nothing else you need to think about seems to me to run against what we kind of know from history about how complicated the ways that the world works are.
Your book is very balanced and nuanced. It's not a call to arms that we must engage in some of these grand geoengineering schemes. It's really that we should have more discussions about them. But give us an idea of the pros and cons, the gains and losses, the unevenness of these grand projects.
Well, the pros are that if you can design systems which would have minimal side effects and could be put into action with support and the knowledge of a representative group of the people affected, then you might genuinely reduce the risks. Disadvantages are that you might damage the case for carbon dioxide reductions. And there are deeper worries as well. One is that there's a very strong psychological sense that the answer is to make things clean again and make things whole again and not to add another technological loop. And there's even a sense that the planet somehow becomes unreal if it becomes a human artifact at a global scale.
Interesting you talk about the sort of inauthenticity of remodelling the planet. How does anyone on the panel feel about the sense that we might be able to remodel the planet with these grand schemes?
A lot of these ideas, we must start looking at them take them much more seriously and start to look at the sort of quantitative evidence and the basis for them. And I'm totally with Oliver on that. My only concern is that we still have a very limited knowledge and understanding of ecosystems and how biological ecosystems work. So, for example, you were mentioning sulfur. So if you change the sulfur in the atmosphere, that has a big impact on atmospheric chemistry, which you discuss in the book. But that will then affect your ozone, and it will also affect the amount of incoming UV. And UV has a direct impact on plants. Good. And in some cases bad. It also affects the microorganisms in the soil, which release methane. So by sorting out one problem, you may well be creating another. And I think we simply don't know enough about how global ecosystems work to risk that on a large scale right now. But I think going forward, we have to do some things that are very critical very quickly. So I would agree.
Aaron, can you think of how it might impact on the types of things you study?
We should add here that we already have a fantastic machine for doing this. It's called a tree. It locks away carbon. So the idea that we should be preserving forests and planting new forests is part of the mix. But I think what I see generally is the lack of a commitment to future planning. It's nearly always the case where a crisis or near crisis point is reached before these technologies are brought in.
The worst conceivable form of geoengineering is one that you bring in at a panic, at a time when the planet is already in some ways off the rails. I think that's one of the reasons I think thinking about it beforehand is so useful.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay, there's another question at the back.
I'm Tim Lucas, and I'm an engineer, structural engineer. If I design something as an engineer and it goes wrong, then I'm kind of responsible for that and to my client, and I might get sued. If a geoengineer designs a system for the planet that goes wrong or causes a weather pattern that might be blamed on it, what do you think the implications of that could be?
Well, significant, I'd imagine, but is there a sort of testing process built in? Engineers iteratively test?
There aren't as yet, but it's worth remembering that we actually have quite a lot of experience with weather modification of various sorts. There have been people doing cloud seeding since the 1940s and 50s, and indeed one of the reasons why that sort of research fell from favour in various places was exactly the fact that it's not whether you do it or not, it's whether if there's any bad weather after you've been doing a weather modification research, someone's going to find a lawyer to tell you that it was your fault. Anything that happens after you start doing such a thing will look like your fault, and that's why doing these sorts of things without a fairly high level of public engagement, public understanding, public discussion is very dangerous.
Sunday morning, the 12th of April, 8 o'clock, 2015. The location is London, and the sky is full of these chemtrails. They are not left by aircraft arriving at the local airports like Gatwick and Heathrow. They are left by other airplanes flying over. Some days it is completely clear, and other days there is this issue that we have with these trails from these aircrafts.
that is all we have time for today. So I want to thank the audience here at Q, and also to my guests, Ilya Leach, Aaron Davis, Oliver Morton, and Kathy Willis. And also thank you to the spectacular Kew Gardens. We'll be back next week. See you.